Okay, hey guys. Sorry this is a little bit late, but it's taken me a while to actually get into a place where I can record. This is lecture 12, and we're just kind of jumping straight into it with Roger van der Weyden. I just want to say, okay, so you've seen the Arnolfini double portrait video. If you haven't, I'd start before you even watch this lecture, just watch that video from Khan Academy that's linked in your email. And then also at the end, make sure you watch this video to the end. I just have a couple of tips for the test that's on Thursday. So things I want to mention about what you're studying, because I was looking at the test again this afternoon, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay. So let's talk about deposition. So this is from an altarpiece commissioned by the Crossbowmen's Guild, which is pretty cool. You can see actually almost immediately that we have references to crossbows in the corners. So that's why it's important to know what guild it was made for. We have Christ coming off the cross, which is also known as deposition. So for the exam, if you're asked to match things that happen in the Bible to pieces of artwork, this would be one of those to know. Now, Roger van der Weyden, we know even less about him than we do about Van Eyck. He does not have a single existing work of art which bears his name. Now, I'm not sure why we know what pieces are by him, except just from accounts, contemporaneous accounts. He may have studied under Master of Flamale, but his relationship with that artist is not completely clear. We do know that he established himself in 1432 as an independent master, and at the peak of his career, he maintained a large workshop in Brussels. He was the official city planner, and apprentices came from as far away as Italy, to study with him. This altarpiece, like I said, was commissioned by the Crossbowmen's Guild, and it's probably done sometime before 1433. We know that because there's that is the earliest copy that is known of that was done by another artist. So obviously if they did a copy of it, it must exist already. Christ is being removed from the cross. This was a popular theme in the 15th century. The size of this panel means that all of these figures were about life size, and that the texture and the detail here is quite amazing, really meticulous. And if you were thinking in terms of the essay question for the exam, you might note that this attention to detail is very Northern Renaissance. Okay, that's one of the things that makes something very obviously Northern Renaissance, is that crazy attention to detail. It's an interesting space that van der Weyden gives us. It's very shallow, which enhances the dramatic effect. It feels as if all of these characters are pushed up into our space. Often Flemish painters would take out the emotion. If you think about Van Eyck's work, there's less emotion than what's going on here. Not van der Weyden. He definitely gives us drama. We see a pose echoed between... Oh, there's some close-up of the detail. That's kind of fun. We see a pose echoed between Mary and... See, I just did this. Okay, if I do select P, here we go, Command P. Here we go. Let's try it. All right, so the motion of Mary is echoed in the motion of Christ, right? So the two of them are in kind of a similar position. Mary has passed out. She's fainted because of her grief, and Christ is dead and is being pulled down off of the cross. So there's a nice mimicking in the sorrow and in the death of Christ. The book points out that the composition should feel unbalanced, because there are 4 figures on the left-hand side, and there are only three figures on the right-hand side, but that the fabric on the figure here holding Christ's legs is so complicated that it balances the composition. This is a nice design idea. This is something that I'll teach in design class, that a heavy pattern will actually cause more visual weight on one side, and that therefore balances the composition. Okay. Here's another that Van der Weyden did. This is Luke drawing the Virgin and Child. Remember, St. Luke was the patron saint of artists. And here he's doing a preparatory drawing for a painting of the Virgin and Child. It was said that he was the only one to have painted them while Mary was actually alive. He was said to be a physician as well, and that is one reason that artists are part of the Physicians Guild at this time, if you recall me telling you that. He's doing a sketch in silver point, which is something like, a bit like graphite, but it's a very, very sharp stylus. Okay. We think that it may be a portrait of the artist himself. If this is true, then there is a strong statement being made. He's perhaps saying the artist is more individualized now. Our medieval predecessors were not individualized, but we are individualized, and we are creating sacred and important works. It has been also interpreted that perhaps he just wants to say that the painter's profession is an important profession. Either way, both readings have a certain amount of propaganda. Look at the very Dutch, this interior, exterior, the way the floor comes up at us a little bit, the high horizon line, the sense of the landscape in the background as well as the interior in the foreground. Those are all very Northern European things to do with the painting. Okay. So, at the mid-century, we have the second generation of Flemish painters. The master of Flamale, Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, are the first generation. So they attract attention. Many people follow them in Flanders. Then this work of the second generation could potentially, according to the book, be easier for us to understand. They contributed to the rapid spread of Flemish style throughout Europe. This is a goldsmith in his shop by Petrus Christus. He was a citizen of Bruges. He became a citizen of Bruges, actually, in 1444, and signed and dated 6 pieces during his career, which spanned 3 decades. This shows a goldsmith with 2 well-dressed customers. Originally, he had a halo. That's the wrong way to say it. He had a halo for a while, but this was removed by restorers because it was originally not part of the painting at all. People looked at it and said, oh, it must be the patron saint, Saint Aloy, patron saint of goldsmiths. Let's give him a halo. But now we understand that that's not true. It was a vocational painting, an actual portrait of a person. And this kind of fits back into our reading of the Arnolfini portrait and why it's important that though we see religious, like nods to religious ideas within the paintings, the people who were asking for the patrons of these paintings were just upper middle class people who had earned a living doing relatively run-of-the-mill things. They were merchants, they were traders, they were goldsmiths. And so all of these paintings don't have to be about saints anymore. They can have a religious connotation or some nods to religious connotations, but it can actually just be a portrait of a goldsmith, and that's really cool. There are raw materials of the jeweler's trade here: containers, rings, brooches, belt buckles, gemstones, coral and crystal cylinders. Okay, there's a close-up so you can kind of take a look. Look at that detail. That's very Northern European. And as in Van Eyck's double portrait, there's a convex mirror which extends the viewer's field of vision. Also, there's a stylishly dressed man and another with a falcon back here. We don't know if this is symbolic. It could have had a practical value. So in terms of the goldsmith probably did have one of these mirrors in his shop so he could see who was approaching his shop, which is interesting. Okay, let's move forward again. Oh, there's the Arnolfini double portrait again. You can see that convex mirror in the background, just in the same way. Okay, Dirk Bouts. This is Virgin and Child. He is best known among Flemish painters as a storyteller. He did a series of large altarpieces with narrative scenes, drawing from the life of Christ and the saints. He also did more intimate pictures. This is obviously the Virgin and Child, who form a nice symmetry. They almost feel mirrored, but it's not a direct symmetry. It's kind of a mimicked symmetry. We could see St. Luke capturing this intimate moment, right? Because St. Luke was supposed to have drawn this. Mary and Jesus both feel like real people. We actually think that the painting is modeled after a 14th century Italian image in the Cathedral of Cambrai. This, obviously it's not true, but it was said to have been painted by St. Luke himself. So that's the image that it was modeled after, which is awesome. Very tender, very human, and though not so much in the case on the right-hand side, here we really feel a little bit more like childlike, like that baby isn't totally childlike, but it's a lot better than some of the stuff we've seen in the past. The one on the right is just plain creepy. Okay, let's talk about the Portinari altarpiece. This is another one that I would pay attention to for the story that's being told in terms of matching to Christian stories. This is important to just kind of know the central image here, which is the nativity, basically. So just know for matching purposes that that is the nativity that's being shown. So he was the dean of the Painters Guild, Hugo van der Goes, and he was the Painters Guild, dean of the Painters Guild in Ghent. He united the intellectual prowess of Van Eyck with the emotional sensitivity of Roger van der Weyden. That's what the book says. Anyway, his major work was a very large altarpiece, which was more than 8 feet tall, this particular Portinari altarpiece, and it was commissioned by none other than Tommaso Portinari. He was the head of the Medici Bank in Bruges. We will talk about the Medicis. Don't you worry. That's not till next, after the test, though. He was sent to Florence and installed in 1483 in the Portinari family chapel. This was, where it had noticeable impact on Florentine painters, which is why we're looking at it right now. Tommaso, his wife, and their 3 oldest children are kneeling in prayer on the side panels. Okay, on the left wing, larger than life, are their name saints, St. Thomas and St. Anthony of Egypt. Okay, you may notice that there is some hierarchy of scale here, which is super frickin' weird. When you see it matched with this Northern European style that we had come to terms with, they're usually, if they're going to do the hierarchy of scale, they do it in a way that kind of makes sense, like things sort of recede into the distance in a way that the hierarchical scale doesn't seem odd to us. But here, people look smaller than they ought to be. The angels in the foreground here, Mary's are obviously larger because she's important. There's just a lot of strange use of scale in this particular piece. So yeah, on the right, Maria and her daughter Margarita with Magdalene and Margaret as their saints. So that's what's going on the right-hand side. The theme of the altarpiece is the Nativity, like I said. There's a host of angels and shepherds who have rushed from the fields. In the middle ground, so these are the angels here, and then you see the baby Jesus. I'm sorry that there's not a close-up. The treatment of Jesus is interesting. He's not swaddled, but naked and vulnerable. As with Van Eyck, aspects of the setting are infused with symbolic meaning. We saw in the Arnolfini double portrait. But here we have a wheat sheaf, which is the house of bread. That's what it's referring to. I'm going to do my pen down here. Wheat sheaf down here. We have lily and iris, which I just read was the symbol of virginity, but I guess also it's red for Christ's blood and the purity of white, and purple for Christ's royalty. So virginity, royalty, purity, they're all in there. The handling of the common people and of the children show that Hugo's artistic vision transcends formal religious symbolism. Okay, let's talk about Hans Memling. I really like this painting, and I still can't figure out who that guy on the right Martin van Nieuwenhoven. I want to figure out who he is. I can't, it's like he totally reminds me of an actor, but I'm not totally sure who that actor is. You guys can, you should post in the comments of the YouTube video. So he seems to summarize and epitomize painting in Flanders during this time. His work has intellectual depth, but also has a delicate prettiness, which made him very popular during the time. He had an international clientele in Bruges, and in 1487, Martin van Nieuwenhove from Bruges, who was a member of a powerful political family, commissioned this diptych. On the right is his portrait, with a vision of the Virgin and Child on the left. We've seen this type of thing before. So he's praying and he's having a vision of Mary and the baby Jesus. He makes this very intimate by placing it in a domestic setting. There is a Book of Hours and a stained glass rendering of his saint. So you can imagine his saint would be Saint Martin, who is in the stained glass at the back. So that's the Saint Martin, done in stained glass. It's nice. And also there's a recognizable landmark in Bruges, which can be seen through the window back here. The Virgin and Child have an idealized delicacy that's not present in the specific portraiture of Martin. So there's a sense that this is done from life and this is not. Are there references? Yes, maybe to the new Adam and Eve. Sorry, yes. The book asks, are there references to the new Adam and Eve? Well, definitely we have the apple being given to baby Jesus, which is something that they would often do, is tie Christ to Adam and Mary to Eve. I also forgot to mention that in that Roger van der Weyden that deposition with Christ coming off the cross, there was a nice skull at the bottom. That skull was a reference to Adam, as we have seen in past pieces. Also, the two paintings, though he's having a vision on the right-hand side, two paintings are connected in this diptych by this swath of fabric, which actually comes into his space. So there is this nice kind of mirroring and a connection between the two pieces. All right, moving on to France. Jean Fouquet, this is quite an interesting piece, and one which I hope you will not forget, because I don't know, I like to use this on slide ID because it's it stands out. Okay, so it's an odd piece. We're back to France, if you notice on your slide ID packet. We've been in Northern Europe, but we know that Northern Europe affected France. And though this is nearly 100 years after the last French work that we looked at, I'm not asking you to identify it any differently on slide ID, just say France. And so now we know what Northern European art looks like. We've made mention of the fact that it's done in oil painting, which accounts for how different things look. And now we move back to France and we see how big an impact Flemish art has made on the art of France in the 15th century. There's definitely distinctive regional variations which can be found throughout Europe, but let's take a look at Jean Fouquet. He was the leading court artist of the 15th century in France. By the mid-century, he had established a workshop in Tours and was a renowned painter. He drew from contemporary Italian classicism, which we're going to look at after the exam, especially when rendering architecture, which is really cool. Also, he was strongly influenced by Flemish illusionism. Among court officials who would commission these paintings from Fouquet was Etienne Chevalier, who was the treasurer of France. That is the man on the left-hand side wearing the red robe. He's appearing there. He has his hands clasped in an Italian-ish setting. That's what the book calls it. He's accompanied by his namesake, Saint Stephen, Etienne in French. There is a mirror-like precision here, as in Flemish art, and we know there must be a likeness. It's also oil on oak panel. So I don't think we saw many oil paintings. I mean, I could be wrong, and I don't want to stop this lecture just to double check, but I'm pretty sure this is the first French oil painting that we've seen in this book so far. So a couple of weird things. We know that Saint Stephen, Saint Etienne, there's a close-up of the patron, and then Saint Stephen, who is bleeding from the head. And it's not entirely clear why that's happening, but could be from a close shave up there. It is a very interesting hairstyle. My interpretation, which has not been shared necessarily by anyone else, is he was Saint Stephen, he was martyred. That's why he's holding this rock here. I think he was hit in the head with a rock, and that's what they're saying. But, that's just me. Anyway. So, the Virgin and Child exist in another world entirely. They're on the right-hand side. This was actually, I don't know if I said this or not, but I think I did. This diptych was supposed to be installed over the tomb of Chevalier's wife, who had died. And what's odd about it is this is not a portrait of Mary as Chevalier's wife. This is a portrait of, this was very popular to do. It's a portrait of the king's respected mistress, who was much loved by the people and by the king. Her name was Agnes Sorel, who died in 1450. So this is not a portrait of the woman whose grave it is going above, or whose tomb it's going above. It's a portrait of the mistress of the king. And it's very interesting. It's both realistic in some ways, but also quite abstracted. She's surrounded by these cherubim that are in red and blue. They appear almost like a tapestry in the background. They do not feel real. She seems celestial, both made of careful description and powerful abstraction. The baby points to acknowledge Chevalier. So you can see down here, he's got his little finger out. Cute. And I mentioned, okay. So really interesting. Hope you take a moment to memorize who Jean Fouquet is. Okay, and here's another artist, Jean Hay, the master of Moulin. He seemed to paint all over the place, and the book classifies him as a French artist, although he did train in the workshop of Hugo van der Goes, and he had a Flemish origin. So, I don't know, I would say Northern Europe, but book says France, and let's just keep it as France, because that's what it says in your packet. This may have been one half of a devotional diptych. Remember, diptych being two. It portrays Margaret of Austria, who was daughter of an emperor. She was supposed to be married to the future King Charles VIII, so she was brought to the French court. Later, she was thrown aside for a more politically expedient marriage. This captures her before that happened, so she's not so troubled. Well, she looks a little troubled to me. Her outfit shows wealth, but the embroidery of C and M signal that she was, I guess, betrothed to Charles. Why don't I see the C and the M? I read straight past that when I was reading my notes. Well, maybe you guys can find what I'm talking about. Definitely the fleur-de-lis pendant proclaims her affiliation with the French court. So she's wearing around her neck. Apparently is a fleur-de-lis. His sensitivity recalls Hugo van der Goes and provides strong evidence that he trained with him. All right, let's talk a little bit about, there's Hugo van der Goes. Cool. All right, this is something I want you to be able to recognize is in the late Gothic, we have something called the flamboyant architecture, which kind of takes this, like you thought you were done with Gothic, you weren't done with Gothic, we're back, because we're in France and they still haven't gotten over it. So flamboyant Gothic is just like Gothic architecture on steroids. It's all over the place. And this is Church of Saint-Maclou in Rouen, Normandy, France. Growing urban populations needed housing. They needed city halls. They needed guild halls and parish churches. And these churches, buildings such as these that we see the late Gothic architecture known as flamboyant, It's got this repeated twisted flame-like tracery patterns going on. See if I got a better, yeah, there's a close-up. Late Gothic masons covered their buildings with increasingly elaborate decoration. They turned to describing the specific nature of the world around them, ivy, hawthorn leaves, other vegetation that would have occurred in their surroundings. But we don't just see, like classically we would have just seen like acanthus leaves, inherited from Rome and Greece. But the Church of St. Maclou in Rouen is a really nice example of this new flamboyant way of showing things. We have, see flame-shaped openings. You can see them down here. It's not just classical anymore. This is definitely a new look. They cast changing shadows across the complex surface of the architecture, so that's nice. It also has these small, knobby, leaf-like ornaments called crockets that are all over the place. And I don't know, I think I may have taken this off of your vocab list, which was probably a mistake, but I don't think I'm testing you on the term crockets. I thought we were far past that, but I forgot about the flamboyant Gothic. So anyway, just know those are crockets. I'm not putting it on the test. Or maybe I will. Just remember they're crockets. They almost obscure the underlying structure. All of this decoration does. Let's look at the flamboyant style in secular architecture. The house of Jacques Coeur reflects the popularity of flamboyant style for secular architecture. Clearly, it is not as elaborate as the church of Saint-Maclou, but it survives almost intact. The inside has been stripped of the rich furnishings, unfortunately, but we're not going to look at the inside. We're just going to look here at the courtyard interior. According to the book, it is a rambling palatial house which is built around an irregular open courtyard. The tympana over each door shows the function of the room. For instance, can we see? Oh, there's a nice drawing of it. Over the kitchen entrance, a cook stirs a large bowl. Let me find that. So over each entrance, there's like a little illustration of what's happening within. So that's the cook stirring. It doesn't look like he's stirring to me, but oh well. There's someone coming to eat. How adorable. There are also puns on the patron's name. You'll see a bunch of hearts over doorways, and that's because the name Coeur, C-O-E-U-R, right there, means heart. So there's puns about that in the sculpture above the doorways, the portals of the rooms. There we go. See? Not letting you guys down in terms of slides. All right. Now we've moved on to the Holy Roman Empire, for what it's worth. This is we're in the Germanic lands, basically, which still kind of technically counts as HRE. Some patrons in the Germanic lands preferred, oh wait, I almost skipped something here. I was going to go straight to polychromy and altarpieces, but we can't not talk about Conrad Witz. So Conrad Witz was a painter and a sculptor in the Germanic lands. He was funded by the church. He was a major proponent of closely examining the physical world. His last large commission before his death was an altarpiece dedicated to St. Peter, the miraculous draught of fishes. Here, Jesus appears posthumously to his disciples as they fish in the Sea of Galilee. Peter leaps from the boat to greet him. Witz sets the scene on the Lake of Geneva with a distinctive mountain rising on the north shore and the Alps shining in the distance. You see in the background. Peter's body and ankles, or actually just his legs here, are distorted by the water. I don't know why I said ankles, but his lower body is distorted by the water. It is one of the earliest times in European art that the artist captures both the appearance and the spirit of nature. So I think just that the way that the water is affecting the visuals is so important. It's really, it is the first time that I can think of that kind of attention to optics that happens Pretty amazing. There's a lot of good things in there for slide ID, guys, so keep an eye on that slide too. Oh, there's a nice close-up. Okay, now this is the one I was going to talk about. Some patrons in the Germanic lands preferred altarpieces with polychromed wood carvings rather than painted panels, right? Because we've been looking at a lot of painted altarpieces. This is a high altarpiece by Michael Packer. It is still installed in its original church setting. There's a surviving contract which specifies the material, subject matter, and even documents. So this, like everything that surrounds this piece, the contracts that were signed, in terms of the materials, the subject matter, and the cost, that document actually exists. It's a contract. The cost of it was 1,200 Hungarian florins. It sets no time limit for its completion. We do know it took about 10 years. When it is open, there is a complicated sculptural ensemble in the middle with 4 large panel paintings on the open shutters that show the life of the Virgin. It's a nice close-up. Gold leaf and delicate carving create a glittering presentation here. We know that Packer oversaw it, but he must have had quite a lot of help. It took many hands to make it. Okay, so the graphic arts. We talked a little bit about printmaking in class today. That was great. Thanks, Patrick, for giving us presentation. I just want to touch on it again. We know that it emerged in Europe at the end of the 14th century. Hooray for the development of the printing press. Now we no longer have simply manuscripts, right? Because they aren't necessarily made by hand anymore. They could be printed, and therefore they are not manuscripts. They used woodcut and engravings on metal. Woodcut had been used for a while in fabric, but only in the 15th century did it appear on paper and in the production of books. This began to replace the copying of each book by hand, and both types were illustrated. The prints were often hand-colored after the fact. Professional artists would draw the image, then professional wood carvers would cut them. This is the Buxheim St. Christopher, and it was one of these devotional images which would be sold as souvenirs to pilgrims at holy sites. It was found in the Carthusian monastery of Buxheim in southern Germany. It was glued to the inside of a back cover of a manuscript. In this image, St. Christopher, who was the patron saint of travelers, carries the Christ child across the river. There are delicate lines which are used for inner modeling, facial features, and short parallel lines indicate shadows. So there is I seriously suggest taking the printmaking class from Phyllis. It's amazing to learn about how to do these things. But you can see that shading and shadows are done with vertical lines here, and that there's other textures. The water is very cool to look at. It has a real texture to it in itself, the way that those horizontal lines move across. The date 1423, which is cut into the block, was thought to identify this print as among the earliest to survive. Unfortunately, recent studies indicate this has to do with some other event, so the print is not from that time period. So they think it was dated for some other reason, which they don't indicate. But we're definitely dating it to the mid-century, mid-15th century, not early. Okay, and we did there was a nice presentation on Martin Schongauer, and he was really the people went to him to learn printmaking and engraving. It's really very, very skillful printmaker, and you gotta love those demons, just so crazy. Okay, and again, here's some information on printed books. You probably just want to pause this and take notes. The earliest printed books were block books. Each page was cut in relief from a single block. There's movable type print, which was developed by Johann Gutenberg, with copies as early as 1455. By the 1470s, there were presses in France, Flanders, Holland, and Spain. intellectual and spiritual life in Europe, and with it, the arts changed forever. So this is one of the things that they reference when people say, why did the Renaissance happen? The printing press is really up there with the reasons that the Renaissance was able to happen. Okay, and then finally, the Nuremberg Chronicles. This is a culmination of complicated collaboration with scholars, artists, and investors in an early capitalist enterprise that is a landmark in the history of printed books. The text of this is a history of the world and was compiled by a physician and scholar, Hartmann Schiedel. He set out to compile the history from an extensive library as well as the work of colleagues. He also set out to publish this work and asked Michael Wolgemott and Wilhelm Pleidenwerf to illustrate. It was published in 1493 in an edition of 2,500. There were 1,809 woodcut illustrations in total, dispersed throughout the book. It could be obtained in Latin or German, parchment or paper, bound or unbound, as it came from the press, or tinted with color. The only instance of a double-page spread without textual restrictions was the panoramic view of the city of Nuremberg, where the enterprise was centered. Okay, so I think that, oh look, there's another close-up. Okay, that concludes the actual presentation. I just want you guys to go back through as you're preparing for this exam, and please let me know if you have any questions. Go on to the Google Drive, same link as usual, and check my my PowerPoint study guide. But also, I just really want you to go back, especially to the 14th century, and look at some of those. Let's see, what's a really good example of one that you should really look at? Bear with me for 1 second so I don't have to pause the damn recording. Okay, if you go back to Giotto, the set from the Arena Chapel, there's four images at once on page 553 of your book. It's got the marriage at Cana, raising of Lazarus, lamentation, and resurrection, which is also known as Noli Me Tangere, which is do not touch me. Those four images, just look at some of these Italian works especially, and be able to recognize, zoom in on them, take a close look and be able to recognize which part of the Bible it's talking about, because there is a matching section and I'm worried it's going to be kind of challenging. So if you guys could just do that for me, that would be great. Just study your vocab, study slide ID, and if you haven't already, watch that video on the double portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, the Khan Academy video, if you need ideas for the essay question. Okay, cool guys. I will see you on Thursday. Bye.